America is opening up relations with Cuba, and it's a big deal, ending decades of hostility and beginning a new era between the two countries. But to understand just how big of a deal, where that hostility really came from, why it took so long to end, you've got to go back, way back. Not to the 1950s, as many Americans might think, but to the 1850s. Now, the story starts with America divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery politics, and one of their many fights is over the Spanish colony of Cuba. Pro-slavery lawmakers want to buy Cuba from Spain, or take it by force to turn it into a new slave state. Anti-slavery politicians oppose this, calling it imperialism.
Hey.
But fast forward to 1898, after slavery's over. Americans have a different version of this same argument when Cubans rise up against Spain. The U.S. joins them, starting the Spanish-American War. But Americans divide. Should the U.S. seize Cuba from Spain for itself? Bigger debate at the time over whether the U.S. should explicitly become a European-style imperial power. So this is an argument about Cuba, but it's also an argument about America, what kind of country it should be. Should America be the kind of country that controls Cuba, or that respects it as a fellow sovereign nation?
Hey.
That's ever since. At this point, in 1898, the fight happens in Congress. Each side passes laws trying to force their way. And it ends up with a weird split baby policy, with Cuba winning independence, but other quasi-imperial American rule. The U.S. would take over Guantanamo Bay, dictate Cuba's foreign policy, and give itself the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Then came the American interventions in Cuba in 1906 and 1917. Each time, the U.S. military takes over for a few years, ostensibly to resolve some political crisis, but that usually means protecting American interests, such as sugar imports. Today, when Americans think about the U.S. and Cuba, we think of the Cold War, but Cubans often think back to this imperial era. And that era technically ends in 1933 with an uprising against Cuba's government. Under U.S. law, America's supposed to intervene again, but President Franklin Roosevelt wants to end the imperial era, so he declares neutrality. And over the next 20 years, Cuba becomes a democracy, and one that's generally friendly with the U.S. That changes in 1952, when a former president and military leader named Fulgencio Batista seizes power in a coup.
Hey.
Suspends the Constitution, and imposes an increasingly oppressive rule. Cuba's communist uprising begins. The American politics at this point is obsessed with fears of communism, so the U.S. backs Batista in the war, no matter how